The billionaire CEO slammed his fist on the conference table and pointed at the rusting private jet outside the hangar. "Scrap it," he said. "This jet is dead." The board nodded in unison. The repair costs were staggering. The aircraft hadn't left the ground in 6 years. 3 separate engineering firms had assessed it, and every single one had walked away shaking their heads. Experts called it a flying coffin. Insurance actuaries had stopped calculating its risk because, in their professional opinion, it no longer qualified as an aircraft, it qualified as a liability. But in the back corner of that cold, oil-smelling hangar stood a quiet man in oil-stained boots. A man nobody had bothered to introduce. A man whose name wasn't printed on any agenda. He said one sentence that made every person in that room laugh out loud. "Give me 90 days, he said, his voice low and steady, "and I'll make that jet fly again." Nobody expected him to expose the biggest mistake in company history. Nobody expected him to expose anything at all. Hargrove Aviation had been one of the most respected private charter companies on the East Coast for nearly 3 decades. It had survived recessions, 2 airline industry collapses, and a global travel freeze that had broken competitors twice its size. But by the time Marcus Hale walked through its front doors as the new CEO, Hargrove was bleeding money at a pace that made its board members sweat through their expensive suits. Marcus Hale was not a man known for sentiment. He was known for results. He had taken 3 failing companies in the previous decade and stripped each one down to its profitable bones, discarded everything else, and sold the remains at multiples that made shareholders weep with gratitude. He wore the same expression whether he was firing a department head or ordering a sandwich, calm, precise, entirely without warmth. When Hale walked into Hargrove's main hangar on a Tuesday morning in late October, he wasn't there to inspire anyone. He was there to make a list. The kind of list that ends careers. The jet in question was a Falcon 800, registration number N447 Bravo. Parked at the far end of the hangar beneath a cover that had developed its own ecosystem of dust and grime. It had last flown 6 years ago, before a series of what the maintenance logs described as unresolvable systems failures had grounded it indefinitely. The previous engineering team had recommended decommissioning. Their replacements had agreed. 3 additional consultants, all credentialed, all expensive, had each come to the same conclusion: the aircraft required repairs so extensive, so structurally complex, that the cost would exceed twice its current market value. Hale didn't need to hear any of that more than once. He pulled the cover partially back, looked at the jet's nose for perhaps 4 seconds, and made his decision. "Scrap it," he said. "This jet is dead." Around the conference table pushed against the hangar wall, 6 members of the board and 4 senior engineers offered variations of agreement, nodding, affirming, producing, supporting documents they'd already prepared for exactly this moment. And in the back of the room, leaning against a tool cabinet with his arms crossed, stood the man in oil-stained boots. His name was Daniel Reeves. He was 38 years old, held no engineering degree, and had been employed at Hargrove Aviation for 14 months as a line mechanic, the lowest classification on the technical staff roster. He drove a truck with a cracked windshield to work every morning before 5 o'clock, ate lunch alone most days, and was generally invisible to everyone above the level of floor supervisor. What the board did not know, what even his direct supervisor barely remembered, was that before Hargrove, Daniel had spent 11 years in the United States Army as an aviation maintenance technician. He had worked on aircraft that the military considered unflyable and made them airworthy again in conditions that would have broken most people. He had done it in desert heat, in monsoon mud, in the back of field tents with flashlights duct taped to his forehead. He had done it because lives depended on it. He was good at it the way some people are good at music, not because someone taught him, but because he could hear things other people couldn't. When Marcus Hale declared the Falcon 800 dead and the board agreed, Daniel Reeves was watching the diagnostic printout on the clipboard that one of the senior engineers had left face up on the edge of the table. He wasn't supposed to be reading it. He wasn't supposed to be in this meeting at all. He'd been asked to stand by in case someone needed a piece of equipment retrieved. But Daniel had a habit of reading everything in reach, and what he read on that printout made something go very quiet inside him. Not the kind of quiet that comes from confusion. The kind that comes from recognition. He read the fault codes listed as the basis for the decommissioning recommendation. He read them twice, and then he looked up at the jet. And he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, that plane isn't dead. Someone wants it to look dead. Nobody heard him, but the thought sat in his chest like something with weight, something real. He filed it away and waited. After the meeting ended and the board members gathered their folders and reached for their phones, Daniel stayed behind. He walked to the jet's access panel and stood there, not touching anything, just reading the surface of the aircraft the way a doctor reads a patient's face. The fault codes on that printout didn't match what he was seeing. They described failures in systems that, from the outside, showed no physical evidence of distress. And in his experience, that kind of mismatch meant one of two things. Either the diagnostic equipment was wrong, or someone had put the wrong information into the diagnostic equipment. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to his toolbox, packed his bag for the day, and drove home to his daughter. Lily Reeves was 9 years old and small for her age, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubbornness. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Daniel came through the door, and she looked up at him the way she always did, like he was the only fixed point in a world that kept shifting. "Rough day?" she asked, which was not a thing most 9-year-olds said, but was a thing Lily said because she had learned, early, to read her father's face. Daniel set his bag down and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Not yet." He made dinner from what was left in the refrigerator, which was not much, and sat across from Lily while she finished her homework, and he thought about the jet. He thought about the fault codes. He thought about the clipboard. And after Lily was asleep, he sat at the table alone with a notepad and wrote down everything he remembered from that printout, from memory, line by line, and began working through what each code actually meant and whether it was consistent with a genuine systems failure or with something else entirely. He had been working on it for an hour when he stopped, looked at what he'd written, and felt something cold move through him. Because what he was looking at wasn't a picture of mechanical decay. It was a picture of mechanical interference, deliberate, informed, and skillfully obscured. He put the notepad face down on the table. Then he picked it up again. He was going to need access to that aircraft. He was going to need more than access. He was going to need 90 days and the willingness to be wrong in front of everyone. The next morning, Daniel Reeves walked into the weekly staff, briefing the one where Marcus Hale formally announced the decommissioning plan for the Falcon 800, and he raised his hand. The room went quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when someone who was not expected to speak decides to speak. The supervisor gave him a look. The senior engineers exchanged glances, and Daniel stood up and said, "I'd like to request 90 days to assess that aircraft before it's scrapped." Marcus Hale looked at him the way a man looks at a street sign, in a language he doesn't read. "Who are you?" Hale asked. Daniel told him his name, his role, his classification. Hale's expression didn't change. "You're a line mechanic," he said. "Our senior engineering consultants, all of them credentialed, assessed this aircraft and determined it's beyond economical repair. You want 90 days. It wasn't a question. It was a repetition designed to make the idea sound absurd by the time it arrived a second time. And around the room, it worked. There was laughter, not loud, not cruel, but the kind of laughter that means people have already decided. Daniel waited for it to pass. "Give me 90 days, he said, "and I'll make that jet fly again." This time, the laughter was louder, but an older man at the far end of the table, Arthur Weston, the longest-serving member of Hargrove's board, a man who had been in aviation for 40 years and had seen things go sideways in directions that surprised him, did not laugh. He looked at Daniel Reeves with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the most important information in a room is often coming from whoever the room has decided to ignore. "What makes you think you can do what 3 engineering firms couldn't?" Weston asked. Daniel looked at him directly. "Because they were looking at what they were told to look at," he said. "I'm looking at the plane." The vote was not unanimous. Marcus Hale voted against giving Daniel the 90 days. 2 other board members voted against it as well, citing liability, insurance complications, and the more practical concern that humoring a line mechanic was not a productive use of anyone's time. But Arthur Weston voted for it, and his was not a vote easily dismissed. He held a significant portion of Hargrove's remaining equity, and when he spoke in board sessions, the room listened even when it didn't want to. The compromise that emerged was narrow and ungenerous. Daniel Reeves would be given access to the Falcon 800 for a period of 90 days, working on his own time, with a minimal tool budget and no additional staff. If the aircraft was not airworthy by the end of that period, he would be terminated without severance. Hale made that last part explicit. 90 days, he said, signing the authorization form with the kind of precision that suggested he considered the whole exercise a formality before the inevitable. Fail, and you're done here. Daniel took the signed form and folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his chest. On the way to the parking lot, his supervisor caught up with him and said, loud enough that 2 other mechanics could hear, "You know, the senior team looked at that plane for 3 weeks. You really think you're going to find something they missed?" Daniel looked at his boots for a moment. "I think I already did," he said, and walked to his truck. That night, he called Lily from the parking lot before driving home. She picked up on the second ring. "Did you do something brave today?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "or something stupid. Sometimes those look the same." She laughed her small laugh. "What are you going to do?" Daniel put the truck in gear and pulled toward the exit. "I'm going to go figure out why someone doesn't want that plane to fly," he said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Lily said, "Bah, can you really fix it?" And Daniel held the phone against his ear in the dark of the parking lot and looked up at the strip of sky above the hangar roof and said, "I have to be able to. If I'm not, we lose everything." He meant the job. He meant the salary. He meant the apartment, the truck payments, the medical bills from Lily's last hospitalization that were still rolling in at intervals. He meant all of it. And Lily, who was 9 and small and wise in the way that children become wise when life asks too much of them too early, said, "Then you will." He believed her, or he made himself believe her. Which in the dark of that parking lot amounted to the same thing. The aircraft access log showed that Daniel Reeves first entered the Falcon 800 at 6:47 in the morning on a Wednesday. 11 days before, the board had expected him to start, because the authorization form said 90 days from signing, and Daniel had begun counting from the minute the pen left the paper. He brought a single toolbox, a flashlight, a notepad, and a thermos of black coffee that he refilled twice a day from the break room machine at the far end of the hangar. He worked alone. He started at the nose and moved backward through the aircraft with the methodical patience of someone who had learned, in environments where mistakes meant lives, that the difference between a problem and a catastrophe was almost always whether you had been paying attention. What he found in the first week was not what 3 engineering firms had found. Because he was not looking where 3 engineering firms had looked. He was looking at the space between the documented findings and the physical reality of the aircraft itself. The maintenance logs, the official ones, filed with the FAA and stored in the company's digital archive, described a cascade of systems failures beginning approximately 18 months before the aircraft was grounded. Hydraulics, navigation, fuel management, each failure compounding the last, until the picture painted by the official record was one of an aircraft simply worn out, exhausted, beyond reasonable salvage. But Daniel had learned to read 2 things at once: the record and the aircraft. And the aircraft, when you stood inside it and looked at it without the record in your hand, told a different story. The hydraulic lines showed no corrosion consistent with the failure age in the logs. The navigation system's physical components, the boards, the wiring harnesses, were in condition that didn't match 6 years of documented malfunction. And in the fuel management bay, he found something that stopped him cold, a component that had been installed recently, not 6 years ago, not even 2 years ago. The manufacturer's date stamp on the housing said 14 months. And the component's identification number did not match anything in Hargrove's parts database, but its design, its structure, its form factor matched a proprietary specification used by a competing charter company called Meridian Air Group. Daniel photographed it from 4 angles with his phone, wrote the identification numbers in his notepad, and stood in the fuel management bay for a long time. He was thinking about what it meant to install a foreign component in an aircraft and not document it. He was thinking about what you could make a component like this do if you understood its function well enough. And he was thinking about the fact that whoever had done this had access to this aircraft, had access to Hargrove's maintenance systems, and had known enough about aviation engineering to make the official record look clean. He replaced the access panel carefully, the way you close a door in a house where someone dangerous might still be inside. Then he went back to his notepad and began writing everything down. 2 nights later, working past midnight with the hangar's main lights off and only his work lamp running, Daniel heard footsteps. Not the heavy, purposeful footsteps of a security guard doing rounds. Lighter than that. A person trying not to make sound. He turned off his work lamp and sat still in the dark cockpit. And the footsteps stopped. He waited 3 minutes, 4 minutes, breathing slowly. Then he turned the lamp back on and went back to work. But the next morning, when he returned to the aircraft, his toolbox had been moved. Not dramatically 6 inches, maybe 8. But he knew exactly where he had left it. And it was not where he had left it. He checked his notepad. Everything was still there, because he kept it in his jacket's interior pocket, against his chest. He checked the fuel management bay. The foreign component was still in place, but one of the diagnostic connectors he had left, plugged in to run an overnight test, had been disconnected. Not accidentally, deliberately, carefully. In a way that someone had hoped he wouldn't notice. He noticed. What Daniel had found in the aircraft's physical structure was damning enough. But what he found when he cross-referenced the maintenance log records against the digital audit trail, the timestamps showing when entries had been made, modified, or deleted, was something else entirely. Records had been edited, not replaced, which would have been obvious. Edited, with timestamps carefully adjusted to avoid triggering the system's automatic inconsistency flags. It was sophisticated work, the kind of work that required both technical knowledge and administrative access at a level well above any line mechanic. The kind of work that pointed upward on the organizational chart. Daniel printed everything he could print from his own system access, photographed everything his phone could photograph, and began building a parallel record, his own documentation of what the aircraft actually showed versus what the official logs claimed. He kept this in a folder in the toolbox in his truck, locked. He kept copies on a flash drive that he wore on a cord around his neck. The sabotage of his work continued. A torque wrench disappeared for 2 days and reappeared in a different drawer. A calibration tool was found with its display cracked, which it hadn't been the previous morning. And one Thursday, a formal safety complaint was filed against Daniel with the hangar floor supervisor, an anonymous report claiming he had been performing unauthorized modifications on a decommissioned aircraft in violation of FAA maintenance protocols. The floor supervisor was required by procedure to pass it up the chain. It landed on Marcus Hale's desk. Hale called Daniel in. The meeting was short. Hale explained that an investigation had been initiated, that Daniel was to stand down from the aircraft pending review, and that the 90-day authorization was suspended until the complaint was resolved. Daniel sat across from Hale's desk and looked at the wall behind Hale's head, a framed photograph of the Hargrove fleet, taken perhaps 20 years ago, when the company had been a different thing. "Who filed the complaint?" he asked. "It's anonymous," Hale said. "I know," Daniel said, "but who has the access level to file a formal safety complaint and have it land on your desk by the next morning?" Hale said nothing. Daniel stood up. "Someone doesn't want me working on that plane," he said. "You should ask yourself why." He walked out. That evening, Lily had a fever. Not a high one, not the terrifying kind they dealt with twice in the preceding year, when her immune system had decided to malfunction in ways that cost money they didn't have. and made Daniel's hands shake at night when she was finally asleep. Just a low fever, the ordinary kind. But Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his folder of documents spread in front of him and Lily, asleep in the next room. And he looked at the numbers in his bank account on his phone, and he thought about the truck payment, and the medical bills, and the job he was about to lose, and the aircraft that he knew in the way he knew things that couldn't be unknowed, was flyable if someone would let him finish the work. He had not eaten dinner. His coffee was cold. He thought about selling the truck. He thought about what he would tell Lily if he had to move them to a smaller place. He sat there for a long time with the overhead light on and the folder in front of him, and eventually he went to Lily's doorway and stood there listening to her breathe, and something in him went very still and very clear. He closed the folder, picked up his phone, and made a list of the parts he still needed. Then he found a buyer for his truck online, a private sale, cash, and arranged to close the deal the following week. He had not expected a call that night. It came at 9:47 from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. When he did, the voice on the other end was quiet, careful, the voice of a man who was choosing each word with the deliberate attention of someone who had made a career of being right about people and was not entirely sure he was being right now. "Mr. Reeves," the voice said. "This is Arthur Weston. I believe you may be correct. I'd like you to meet me tonight, if you can." Daniel looked at the folder on the table, at the flash drive around his neck, at the closed door of his daughter's room. "Where?" he said. They met in a parking garage 2 miles from the Hargrove facility, which felt, Daniel thought, like something from a movie, but then, real things had a way of looking like movies when they were serious enough. Weston was already there when Daniel arrived, standing beside a dark blue sedan, dressed in what appeared to be the same clothes he'd worn to the office. He was in his mid-60s, with the careful posture of a man who had survived a long career by never quite relaxing. He handed Daniel a folder. Not a digital file, not a forwarded email, an actual physical folder, the kind with a metal clasp. "There was an incident," Weston said, 8 years ago. "A different aircraft, a different grounding. The official investigation concluded it was mechanical failure due to improper maintenance. 2 pilots were suspended. One of them never worked in aviation again." Daniel opened the folder. In the parking garage's yellow half-light, he read through it quickly, stopping on certain pages. "Going back. The maintenance logs from that incident," Weston said quietly, "show the same type of editing anomalies as the ones you found on the Falcon 800. Daniel looked up. "Same person? Same method," Weston said, "which suggests the same person, or someone who was trained by the same person, or someone who learned from what succeeded the first time." He paused. "The company that benefited from Hargrove's grounded fleet in that period," he said, "was Meridian Air Group." The parking garage was very quiet. Somewhere below, a car door slammed. Daniel looked back at the folder and thought about the component he had found in the fuel management bay, with Meridian's specification stamp on its housing. "They're trying to buy Hargrove," he said. It wasn't a question. Weston said nothing for a moment. Then, "They're trying to buy it at a price that only makes sense if Hargrove's fleet value has been systematically destroyed. And someone inside Hargrove has been helping them do that for years." Daniel closed the folder and held it against his chest, both arms across it. "Who?" "That," Weston said, "is what I need you to help me prove." There was a photograph in a box in the back of Daniel's closet, under a winter jacket, under a pair of Lily's outgrown shoes. It showed a younger version of Daniel, in uniform, standing in front of an aircraft that had not, by any reasonable engineering assessment, been capable of flight when he'd received it. He'd made it fly. That had been in the 3rd year of his service, in a forward operating base where the alternative to making that aircraft fly had been leaving 3 people stranded in a place where being stranded meant dying. He had been 26 years old and had worked for 31 hours without stopping and had figured it out because there was nothing else to figure out. He had never talked about it much. After the service, he'd come home to a wife who was beginning to lose weight in a way that the doctors were still explaining, and then to a daughter who needed more of him than the world had prepared him to give. and then to a grief so large and so quiet that it had simply become the atmosphere he lived in, something he breathed, something present in every room but never named. He had taken the Hargrove job because it was the only aviation work within driving distance that would hire him without a college degree, and he had been grateful for it the way a man is grateful for a rope when he is already in the water. Now he stood in the fuel management bay of the Falcon 800 at 11 o'clock at night, 3 weeks after Arthur Weston had handed him that folder. And he was not alone. He had been reinstated. The safety complaint investigation had quietly concluded without findings, which Weston had facilitated without making the intervention visible, and he had used the time during his suspension to do something he had not done since leaving the service: ask for help. He had gone to 3 of the hangar floor mechanics, men he had worked beside for 14 months, without ever quite crossing the line from coworker to colleague. He had shown them what he had found: the edited logs, the foreign component, the audit trail anomalies, and he had asked them, without promising anything, whether they would help him finish the job. The first one said no immediately. The second asked questions for an hour, and then said yes. The third looked at the documentation for a long time and said, "My father lost a job at a charter company 8 years ago. I always thought something was wrong about how that happened." Daniel hadn't said anything. He'd let that sit between them for a moment. Then the third mechanic, whose name was Gary Paulson, had picked up a wrench and said, "Where do we start?" The night the left engine turned over for the first time, not started, not run up, just turned over, the rotors moving in their housings for the first time in 6 years. The 3 of them stood on the hangar floor and did not speak. The sound was rough, reluctant, the sound of something being asked to remember what it had been. But it was a real sound. It was the aircraft's sound. Gary Paulson put his hand flat against the fuselage and looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the cockpit. He was thinking about the photograph in the box in the back of his closet. He was thinking about his daughter asking, from her bed in the dark, "Ba, do you really think you can fix it?" For the first time since this started, he thought that the answer was yes, not as a hope, not as a performance, but as a fact that had just announced itself in the physical world. "Let's clean up," he said, "and get back tomorrow." Gary nodded. The other mechanic, whose name was Thomas Hewitt, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and then looked immediately at the floor, which was a response Daniel understood and respected and did not mention. The file disappeared on a Friday. Daniel arrived at the hangar at 5:45 in the morning and went to the system terminal where he had been maintaining his digital documentation log. A separate file, password protected, that contained his working analysis of the maintenance record anomalies. It was gone. Not the terminal, not the system, just his file. He checked the backup. Gone. The system showed a deletion event at 2:17 in the morning, attributed to his own login credentials, which meant someone had his credentials, or had obtained them, or had been given them by someone with system administrator access. He stood at the terminal and felt, for the first time since this had started, something close to despair. Not full despair, the physical kind. The kind that sits on your chest and stops your breath. Just the early version of it. The cold, reasonable kind that comes when you have been working towards something for months, and suddenly the ground shifts under it. He went to the aircraft. The fuel system, which he had spent 2 weeks carefully rerouting around the Meridian component he'd documented, but left in place as evidence had been accessed overnight. Someone had reconnected a bypass line that should not have been connected. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing that, in a standard pre-flight check, might not be caught. In an actual flight, it would cause a fuel delivery irregularity that would present as engine failure at the worst possible moment. It was, in other words, not sabotage designed to keep the aircraft grounded. It was sabotage designed to make the aircraft crash. Daniel took 60 photographs in the next 40 minutes. He sent copies to 3 email addresses, one of which was Arthur Weston's, and one of which was a personal account he maintained on a server that had nothing to do with Hargrove's systems. Then he went to Marcus Hale's office and knocked on the door and said, "I need 5 minutes." Hale looked up from whatever he was reading with the expression of a man who had decided he was done humoring people and had chosen this morning to demonstrate it. The flight test is in 12 days, he said. If you're here to tell me there's a problem, I'm here to tell you the aircraft is being sabotaged, Daniel said. By someone with facility access and system administrator credentials, and that whoever is doing it has now moved from trying to keep the aircraft grounded to trying to make it crash. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the distant sound of a ground vehicle moving across the tarmac. Hale looked at him for a long moment. That is an extremely serious accusation, he said. I know, Daniel said. Here are the photographs. He put a printed set on the desk, then he walked out, and Hale's assistant, who had heard the whole thing from the anteroom, did not meet his eyes when he passed. The call came that afternoon. Marcus Hale, on the phone, his voice stripped of the careful control Daniel had always heard in it. Not emotional, exactly, but thinner, less certain. Come back in, he said. Daniel was in his truck in the parking lot eating a sandwich. Now? Now, Hale said. Daniel looked at the sandwich, put it on the passenger seat, and went back in. What had happened, while Daniel had been in the parking lot, was this. Arthur Weston had requested an emergency board session, and, in that session, had presented documentation, physical documents, paper copies, the kind that require physical destruction to eliminate that showed a pattern of systematic asset value manipulation at Hargrove Aviation spanning 4 years. The documentation traced a campaign of deliberate technical sabotage across multiple aircraft, coordinated with a series of below-market acquisition proposals from Meridian Air Group, and pointed with evidence, substantial enough that 2 board members had gone pale, and one had quietly put his phone away without making the call he had been about to make at a senior director named Richard Salter, who had been with Hargrove for 9 years and was, at this moment, in a meeting on the 2nd floor with 3 people from Meridian's legal team, which was itself a kind of evidence. The board had voted to convene a formal investigation and to preserve all company records pending external review. Arthur Weston had then said, I believe we owe Mr. Reeves an apology and an unimpeded path to complete his work. Marcus Hale had not said anything for a moment. Then he had picked up his phone and called Daniel. Richard Salter was escorted from the building that same afternoon by 2 men from the company's legal counsel who had been in contact, for the past 72 hours, with federal investigators. He walked out through the main lobby with his jacket over his arm, and his face composed in the expression of a man who had prepared several alternative explanations for this moment and had not yet decided which one to use. The security footage from the hangar, the footage captured on a small camera mounted above the secondary tool storage unit. A camera that Salter had apparently not known existed, installed 18 months ago by the facility's maintenance crew, without appearing in the hangar's official camera inventory, showed him clearly, at 2:15 in the morning, at the fuel management bay of the Falcon 800. It showed everything. Marcus Hale watched the footage on a laptop in the conference room with 6 board members and said nothing for a long time afterward. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the blank screen after it finished, and Daniel Reeves, who was in a chair against the far wall and had watched it alongside everyone else, watched him. What he was looking at in Hale's face was something he recognized not as weakness, but as the particular expression of a person who is recalculating something they had assumed was settled. Hale had built his reputation on the certainty of his assessments. He had been certain about this aircraft. He had been certain about Daniel. He looked now like a man doing the math on what his certainty had cost. You knew from the beginning, Hale said. It was directed at Daniel, not an accusation. Something between a question and a concession. I knew something was wrong, Daniel said. I didn't know what until I was inside the aircraft. But you were right. Daniel looked at the blank laptop screen. The aircraft was right, he said. I just listened to it. Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man choosing words that had not come easily, Can you actually make it fly? And Daniel said, It could always fly. It just needed someone who believed it. The day of the flight test was the 43rd of November, which meant it arrived with a cold that came off the Atlantic and made the tarmac surface gleam and turned the mechanic's breath visible in the morning air. The Hargrove facility had not seen this many people on the flight line in years, staff from every department. Word having traveled through the building in the days following Richard Salter's removal with the speed and intensity of something people had needed to believe in, and hadn't had a reason to until now. There were 3 vehicles from the media parked outside the main gate, because the story, a single mechanic, a grounded aircraft, a conspiracy to destroy a company had leaked the way stories like that always leak. Incrementally, and then all at once. The FAA representative who would certify the airworthiness test was on the tarmac by 7 o'clock. Arthur Weston was there. Marcus Hale was there, standing apart from the group with his hands in the pockets of his coat. His face unreadable in the way it was always unreadable, though perhaps, Daniel thought, with less certainty behind it than before. Daniel went through the pre-flight with Gary Paulson and Thomas Hewitt. The 3 of them moving around the aircraft in the cold morning air, with the focused quiet of people doing something that matters. Lily was there too. She had taken the school bus to the facility instead of to school, which Daniel had pretended not to know about, and had actually called her homeroom teacher to quietly arrange. She stood near the fence at the edge of the flight line in her coat with the hood up, and Daniel could see her from the cockpit window when he settled into the left seat and began working through the startup checklist. The first engine started cleanly. The second, then the third. The sound of the Falcon 800's engines coming to full life filled the hangar apron and traveled across the tarmac and reached the people standing at the edges of the flight line as something physical, not just sound, but air pressure, the particular warmth of jet exhaust in cold morning air, the sense of something enormous reawakening. A warning light illuminated on the fuel management panel. Daniel looked at it, checked his instruments, looked at Gary through the cockpit window. Gary was already checking the fuel line at the access panel on the starboard side. 20 seconds later, he gave a thumbs up. The warning light went off. Daniel exhaled. He looked at the checklist. He looked at the instruments. He looked at the end of the runway. Then he looked at the fence, at the small figure in the coat with the hood up, and he thought about a night 4 months ago sitting at a kitchen table with cold coffee and an empty refrigerator and a folder of documents and a daughter sleeping in the next room. He released the parking brake. The Falcon 800 moved, slowly at first, the way something large and long still moves with a kind of reluctance, a hesitation, as if it too understood what was being asked of it and needed a moment to decide. It rolled toward the runway, and the crowd on the flight line was almost completely silent, and the sound of the aircraft filled the space around it the way the aircraft itself filled the runway, completely, undeniably. At the runway threshold, Daniel ran the throttles up to takeoff power, and the engines answered without hesitation. All 3 of them, clean and strong, the kind of sound that experienced aviation people recognize as right, even before the instruments confirm it. The aircraft began to accelerate. The tarmac rushed past. The nose came up. And then the Falcon 800, which had not been airborne in 6 years, which had been declared dead by experts and condemned by a CEO and targeted by a conspiracy designed to reduce it to scrap, lifted free of the runway and climbed into the cold November sky. The silence on the flight line lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then it broke, not gradually, not politely, but all at once. Everyone, maintenance staff and board members and the FAA representative and the media people at the fence, and Gary Paulson and Thomas Hewitt, all of them making noise at the same time, the way people make noise when a thing they half believed in decides to be real. Arthur Weston put his hands over his mouth and stood very still. Marcus Hale looked up at the sky and kept looking. And Lily Reeves, at the fence, watched her father's aircraft climb away from the ground. And she was crying. And she was not embarrassed about it. And she said, quietly enough that no one heard her except herself, "I knew he could. I knew he could." The flight lasted 47 minutes. Daniel flew a circuit over the facility, then south along the coast, then back. The aircraft performed without a single fault indication. Every system ran within specification. The FAA representative, who had seen hundreds of airworthiness certifications and maintained a professional neutrality that was more or less impervious to narrative, looked at the instrument data when Daniel taxied back and was quiet for a moment and then said, "She's clean." He signed the certification document on the hood of a car on the tarmac And Daniel held the signed document with both hands and read it twice, and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his chest, next to where the authorization form had been 90 days ago. The board meeting that followed was, by every account of everyone who attended it, unlike any board meeting Hargrove Aviation had ever held. This was partly because of the video footage and the federal investigation and the documentation that Arthur Weston had compiled over months, all of which collectively revealed a scheme that had, according to preliminary estimates, cost Hargrove Aviation somewhere in the range of $60 to $90 million in suppressed fleet value over 4 years. It was partly because the Meridian Air Group acquisition proposal, a document that Richard Salter had, investigators discovered, already prepared and was waiting to present at a board meeting scheduled for 3 weeks from now, was submitted to the board as evidence of how close the company had come to being sold at a fraction of its actual worth. But mostly it was unlike any board meeting Hargrove had ever held because, near the end of it, Marcus Hale stood up and said something that no one in the room had expected to hear from him. "I judged this man," Hale said, "by his title and his boots and the fact that nobody vouched for him. I was wrong." He was not looking at Daniel when he said it, he was looking at the table, in the way of someone who has spent a great deal of their life not looking at tables, and is doing so now because the directness of the alternative would require more than he was ready for. "I owe you an apology," he said. And then he did look at Daniel. "For what I assumed about you, for what I almost allowed to happen to this company, because I was too certain about the wrong things." The room was very quiet. Daniel looked at him steadily. "I appreciate that," he said. The offer that Hale and the board extended to Daniel that day was, by any standard, extraordinary. The position of Chief Technical Officer, with a salary that would have required him to count several zeros to understand, plus a stock equity package that would, if the company's valuation recovered to where analysts now estimated it should be without the suppression of fleet value, make him a wealthy man before he turned 45. He listened to all of it. He sat with his hands flat on the conference table, an echo, though he didn't know it, of Marcus Hale's posture watching the security footage, and he looked at each person in turn. Then he said, "I'll take the role, but I need 2 things before I'll sign anything." There was silence. Hale said, "Name them." Daniel said, "First, every maintenance worker and floor mechanic at this facility gets full health insurance coverage. Not partial. Full. Effective immediately." Nobody spoke. "Second," he said, "the company establishes an education fund for the children of Hargrove employees. Accessible to everyone, not just senior staff." Arthur Weston made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. Hale looked at Daniel for a moment. Then he looked at the board. "Those both sound reasonable," he said, and the tone in which he said it was something different from anything Daniel had heard in his voice before, something less armored, less certain, perhaps more honest. "Anything else?" Daniel thought for a moment. "One more thing," he said. "I want Gary Paulson and Thomas Hewitt promoted to senior technical specialists. They did the work. They should get the title." Hale wrote something down. "Done," he said. 3 weeks after the flight test, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the color of something that couldn't quite decide between blue and gray, Daniel Reeves brought his daughter to the hangar. Lily walked around the Falcon 800 slowly, trailing her fingertips along the fuselage, the way Daniel had stood touching the aircraft's surface in the dark months ago. She looked at the cockpit, at the engines, at the wings that had lifted the aircraft out of 6 years of stillness, and into the cold November sky. "Can we go up?" she asked. Daniel looked at the aircraft, and then at his daughter, and then at the sky through the open hangar doors. "Yeah," he said, "we can go up." He filed a flight plan and pre-flighted the aircraft the way he always pre-flighted it, methodically, completely, with the patient attention that was less a habit than a form of respect. Lily sat in the right seat of the cockpit and watched him work through the checklist and asked questions about everything, which Daniel answered without abbreviation, without condescension, because she was 9, and she was his daughter, and she deserved complete answers. They taxied out in the gray morning light. and the aircraft lifted away from the runway with the quiet authority of something that had found its proper element. And the city fell away beneath them, the roads and the buildings and the parking lots and the hangar and all of it, reduced by altitude to pattern, to geometry, to something beautiful and abstract. Lily looked out the window for a long time without speaking. The horizon was a long, pale line where the ocean met the sky. Daniel flew them south for 20 minutes, then turned back. Lily had her face close to the window. "Bah," she said, which was a name she had always used for him and which he had never asked her to change because some things are true before they're explained. "Do you know that you're a hero?" He looked at the instruments. He looked at the horizon line. He thought about a parking lot, and a kitchen table, and a truck he'd sold, and a folder of documents he'd carried against his chest. He thought about 11 years in uniform, and the photograph in the box in the closet. He thought about a woman with his daughter's eyes, who had made him promise, near the end, to keep going, just those 2 words. Keep going, which was either the simplest instruction anyone had ever given him, or the most demanding one, depending on the day. He smiled. Not the performed kind of smile. Not the kind you wear in a room full of people who are watching. The quiet kind. "No," he said, "I'm just somebody who didn't quit." Lily looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, the ocean was very far below and very still. "That's the same thing," she said. He didn't argue with her. He leveled the wings and let the aircraft carry them home. The federal investigation into Richard Salter and the Meridian Air Group conspiracy took 14 months to conclude. During that time, Hargrove Aviation's fleet was fully reassessed by an independent team that Daniel had selected himself, and the company's actual market value was found to be substantially higher than any estimate made during the years of suppression. The stock price recovered. The workforce stabilized. The health insurance program that Daniel had requested as a condition of his appointment was implemented without complication. And in the first year, 3 mechanics and 1 administrative assistant received treatment for conditions they had been managing without medical support because they had not been able to afford it. The education fund was established with a board-appointed trustee and began accepting applications for the following academic year. Marcus Hale remained as CEO. He was, by most accounts, different afterward, not softer, exactly, but more careful. More given to listening before deciding. More willing to sit with uncertainty before declaring something resolved. He and Daniel did not become close friends, but they developed a working relationship that both of them seemed to find sufficient, which, in a corporate environment, and between 2 people who had started from where they'd started, was perhaps more than anyone had a right to expect. Daniel kept the flash drive on the cord around his neck for another 6 months after the investigation concluded a habit. He told Gary, when Gary asked. That was hard to break. He eventually took it off and put it in the box in the closet, next to the photograph from his service years, next to the outgrown shoes, next to the things that had made him who he was, before anyone thought to ask who that was. He drove a different truck now, not new but reliable, and he arrived at the facility every morning before 6 and walked the flight line the way he had always walked it, methodically, quietly, reading the aircraft, the way the aircraft asked to be read, and sometimes, walking past the Falcon 800 where it stood in its place in the hangar, he put his hand flat against the fuselage and felt the cold aluminum under his palm, and thought that there were many ways a thing could be declared dead, and only one way it could prove otherwise, by flying. The aircraft had proven it. He supposed, in some way that he would never quite say out loud, that so had he.